Two guys.
Yeah.
Hey, I was going to say Rick is in charge.
All right. So Max, let me know when you get the live stream up. Give me the thumbs up and we'll start. All right.
I'm here to listen.
So we get to look at Genesis 21 today. Many of you got your preview on the story of Ishmael last week. And I've titled this Growing Relationships with Outsiders. I think that as a New Testament church, it's incumbent on us to live in a community as strangers or with different values, but to build these relationships in a way that entices others to engage us in conversation, that is fragrant, that is the way that Christ lived in his ministry, where all the sinners and the tax collectors and the people who were outcasts came to him. It was one of the critiques. What are you doing hanging out with all these people? I may have said before, I think there's an interesting element if we really think logically about this. The people that were going in the most carnal way of sinful parties and all the things they would have had exposure to, why did they choose to hang out with Jesus? You know, he wasn't some stick in the mud. He wasn't some boring guy. There was something about him and the way that he exuded real life that was significant. And so I think we have to wrestle through that. How do I stand apart in my values but close in my relationships? And so just by way of review, Colin did a great job kind of summarizing these ideas yesterday, that God loves outsiders and you should too, that God has a plan. And I think that's important as we see through the Old Testament. This is one of the rubs sometimes people outside the faith have, is how come there's times when God says we'll slaughter a people group? And many of these were practicing child sacrifice and doing some things that I think we would deem evil even by today's societal standards. That, you know, there is this provision for the innocents, no doubt, but I think there's also a point where God's judgment does come, as we saw with Sodom and Gomorrah. You can go too far. I also think it's important we think about this providing and being present. Are we operating as the hands and feet of Christ in our community? Is it tangible? Is it visible? Is it obvious that the church is part of the solution instead of the problem? Ultimately, in our loving of outsiders, I think it's very important to own our errors. We've talked about this before, being quick to apologize when we don't get it right. We're flawed. We're going to make mistakes. Newsflash. And I think most of the non-believers I encounter will recognize and even show some grace if I own it. If I try and defend it or excuse it away, then they're entitled to say, wait a minute, there's hypocrisy there. And I don't think that in this life we achieve perfection. I know we achieve grace and justification and sanctification over time, but that's radically different than perfection. And I think this is the good news of the gospel, is saying in spite of my flaws and failings, God makes up the difference. He makes up the gap. He closes this brokenness in me to his perfect, holy healing plans. Living peaceably, going the extra mile. I mean, these are all very biblical concepts of engaging with others in a way that's Christ-like in love. And so my key or big idea for today is that as Christians, we are called to be God's representatives to a lost and hurting world. Anybody think that we're not a lost and hurting world? All right, we're all on the same page then. But, how do we reach this? What is the evidence in our life that is compelling for the person that is in the midst of pain and may have been beat up in some religious experience in the past even? I was having a discussion yesterday, and somebody was telling about how, there was almost this offense that a person was living a Christ-like world or holding to a Christian worldview. And I said, well, those are usually the ones in my experience that are actually closest to God. They're fighting so hard to avoid any discussion of God or any relevance of God that, to me, it shows, okay, you know what truth is. You're actively and overtly trying to dismiss it. This isn't some passive, well, I don't know. This is a tug-of-war with God. We have been set free of the slavery of sin, and I think we see this modeled as Hagar is released as a bondservant, granted to the desert. There's a lot of discussion whether it was intended that she would go out and die or just be free. But I think Christ also has freed us, and now we choose what comes next. That we have been the recipient of God's plan for a particular people group, community, as well as nations. That we, as non-Jews, saw this redemptive work. We see the kind of the foreshadowing, if you will, with Ishmael, and even the treaty with Abimelech, that God says, yes, I have a chosen people, I have a land, I have a purpose, but my long-term aim was obviously to redeem all nations and all people. We see this fulfilled in the form of Christ, and now we as New Testament believers have been given the Great Commission to go forth and spread the gospel to all people, even to the ends of the earth. And I think this is where, maybe some of us will do short-term missions trips, but for sure we all go to the grocery store. We all have a group of friends that are secular. And I think this is where God starts to say, you are part of my plan of redemption, that your actions have consequences. We also have this idea of God has made this loving covenant with us through Christ for salvation. That, some of these earthly covenants, hey, we'll live peaceably together, we'll share wells or lands, that's great, but those are temporal. What we're talking about, what's eternal, and when God comes along and says, hey, I'm here, I've revealed myself in the form of my son, I've been willing to put him even to death for your redemption. This is not something that's fading or temporal or fleeting. And I think there's a substantiveness to our walk in Christ. If others observe it over time and we do it well, I think there's a natural question that arises, why do you respond differently? Why are you reacting differently? And at the ultimate, when we in turn are called to be his witnesses and to live with these outsiders, that am I reflecting Christ well? If someone sees me with even my flaws, do they see Christ in me? Do they see a transformation over time that's showing deeper character, more love, more joy, more peace, more patience? Is this part of what is observable in my life? Because my experience generally is, apart from God, people's change, if there is any, tends to be negative. It tends to be more self-consumed and more selfish and more ego-driven, not less. And so I think there's this growing divide, if you will, over time. And C.S. Lewis paints a great picture of this in The Great Divorce. If you haven't read it, it's a great read. Not necessarily the most popular of his books, but a really good read. We covered Ishmael's story last time, so I'm just going to give a couple of bullets and as a recap. I think it's important that we recognize God heard Ishmael's cry. Here's someone who's mocked the plan of God in essence, who, yes, was rejected by kind of the earthly caretakers, if you will. But at the point of his crying out, God heard. And I think this is true of my experience. It's true of a lot of people, that when they are seeking God, maybe in the midst of their brokenness or the dark night of the soul, God responds. And I always encourage people that are trying to, either find the beginning step of faith or trying to grow it a little bit, is crowd to God. He'll hear, he'll respond. Watch, keep a journal of the things you ask for and watch what God does to show up. I think it's very interesting, God's provision and care for him, in spite of the fact God obviously knew he would become the father of the Arab nation, which to this day is in conflict with the nation of Israel. That quite frankly, those that ultimately ended up as the enemies of God's plan, very heavily Muslim today, would be the ones that God says, I'm going to give special provision for you. And I think it gives us hope as believers that whatever we've done along our journey, God does provide and care for us. The scripture talks about while we were yet enemies of God. I think it's very interesting, this idea of having 12 sons, to mirror kind of Isaac, this multiplication of blessing. And then ultimately, if God demonstrates love for those that oppose his plans, how much more for those of us that choose to try to follow him. You know, if this is the type of miraculous provision God's interested in, even for those distant from God, and Christ makes this idea of if the lilies of the field and the sparrow is cared for by God, how much more those of us that are in the kingdom. And I think there are times and seasons of life that God may feel distant. I totally get that, but I think it's important that we continue to reflect. You know what? God is interested in providing. He is interested in caretaking. He is interested in a specific purpose and path for my life. That I was uniquely made for this time, this place, with my skills and limitations. And Paul talks about it. In his weakness, God was glorified. And I don't think that's a very Western concept in the rugged individualism of our culture. We're supposed to be strong, not weak. And I think there's a difference, certainly, between meekness and weakness. I think there's a choice to not exert our rights and our opportunities, but it's a reliance on God to say, look, if you're not doing this, I'm in trouble. And when I don't see you moving around me, maybe I need to pause and go, did I take the wrong turn? Is there something that God intended me to be doing instead? And I've certainly had those seasons of life. I've found him more distant. I've made mistakes. I've not followed the calling of his plan for my life for a season. And then he kind of redirects and brings things back. And I found, unfortunately, the volume kind of gets turned up. And I love C.S. Lewis's line, pain is God's megaphone. And unfortunately, I've had painful things in life, and it was God using the megaphone in my life to say, hey, here's something I need you to learn. Sometimes it was be still and know I'm God, which is not in my wiring. You know, sometimes it was, you know what, you need to be more forgiving because you have been forgiven. And so I think, you know, focusing a little bit on this treaty between Abimelech and Abraham, you know, I think there's the tendency to quickly go through it and view it just as this earthly thing. And there were clearly earthly components to it, you know, to being basically a peace treaty and ultimately to share wells and lands. But I think behind that, it's interesting to me that this pagan king, you know, and granted Abimelech's territory wasn't destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah, it wasn't that evil, but it clearly is the case where he was not deemed righteous. He was not one of the righteous kings. And he saw God was with Abraham. And I wonder, amongst our family and our unbelieving friends, would they say, God is with you? Would it be their impression that God is in relationship with you? And if not, why not? Because Abraham was flawed. I mean, his last dealing with Abimelech, he lied about Sarah being his wife and created a plague for his household. I mean, this had not gone well. It wasn't that he was somehow perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And we've seen multiple cases where Abraham got it wrong. But somehow there was a sense of God's provision for Abraham. And again, he was fundamentally living a nomadic lifestyle. You know, he hadn't put down roots, so to speak. I mean, all the references we've seen so far around him is talking about a tent. You know, this isn't like he built some great empire to himself or statues or collected wealth, at least in the traditional sense. Yes, probably had herds and animals and those things. But it was something unique. Abimelech did remember very vividly that Abraham had not been truthful before. And so I think it's interesting, and he actually calls him out for it. You know, that I need you to deal truthfully and fairly. And yet Abimelech, in the middle of all this, has treated Abraham very kindly. It said you can have your, you know, herds go through and graze and go onto the land. You know, there obviously was some level of sharing of well. Maybe it was a dispute on Beersheba particularly, but even after being lied to and his household encountering basically a plague, he still sent Abraham on his way with a blessing and with money. And so I think there's this interesting dynamic where somehow Abraham and Abimelech came to an understanding. And I think for us living in a secular world where we live at a time where now if we disagree about certain things, somehow we can't be friends is the new standard. I think we've got to find ways to transcend that and be engaged in conversation. We can hold values. I think we have to be prudent in what we choose to talk about sometimes, to not intentionally give offense, but to be quick to try to reconcile, to be quick to try to close the gap. It's also interesting that Abraham swears the covenant to be binding even on future generations, where we know God has promised this land to Israel, and eventually there will be this rub for territory. I also think it's interesting, the 7 U's, and we see kind of from a numerology view, very often 7 is God's number. It's certainly a number of completeness. We see it in creation. We see it in, unfortunate revelation, the plagues and such. This number keeps repeating. And I also think it's important that, from this place of agreement, where they had come together, they'd made this beginning of a peaceable agreement, then he was able to kind of bring up a specific problem. Hey, this well we're in dispute with. How often in our lives are we looking for complete resolution of whatever problems or frictions we have with someone before we're really engaging with them and finding commonality and demonstrating love? Where, to a degree, Abraham said first, okay, we'll agree to live peaceably. He didn't know if this issue over the well was going to be resolved when he said that. And so I think it's important that we also draw that concept. Partial agreement sometimes is as good as we're going to get. There's a great phrase, we'll have to agree to disagree. That some things I don't need to be right about. And so I pull this passage out of Colossians 4, 5, and 6. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Make the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. In case you didn't figure it out yet, this is our tee up to our apologetic series too. Being ready with a ready answer, a ready defense, being able to sprinkle in salt, truth, into conversations in little bite-sized pieces, little shakers. I don't need to dump the whole thing out at once, but I can begin to articulate why I believe what I believe, what my experiences are, why I think God has proven to be real in my life. And there's an intentionality here. I think this idea of making best use of the time is part of that metric. Are we planting seed on soil that's good soil? Or are we dealing with rocky stuff that maybe it's not our season, it's not us? Who's called to change or plant the gospel in that case? But I also think it's this idea of being gracious, of being kind in our language, of demonstrating Christ-like love and wisdom. Beersheba is going to keep coming back, in case you hadn't figured this out. It's kind of defined as the southern border of Israel when the nation is formed. You can see kind of the red arrow to the bottom, Dan being the northern side of the border. The literal translation can mean either the well of the oath or of the seven. I think the most common use is well of the oath because that was the primary thing that transpired. It is referenced 34 times in the Bible, so there's multiple engagements in and around this area. It's interesting to me that, this is heavily desert region. And so obviously wells would have been very important, but just it wouldn't have been the most hospitable piece. And we saw this even very early on when Abraham and Lot separated. Lot chose to go down into the nice green fields, and Abraham took kind of the high ground in the rocky areas and desert. This ultimately becomes part of the area of the tribe of Judah. We think of the 12 tribes. And today, it's a city about the size of Spokane. It's about 200,000 people. And so, it is a metropolitan area today. Obviously, the benefit of irrigation and modern water systems helps tremendously. Still isn't necessarily exactly an agricultural area. that still has some pretty high saline content just due to its proximity to the Dead Sea. The other one that's interesting to me is this idea of him planting a tamarisk tree. Because I think sometimes we will read something like this and skip through it. You see a couple of pictures of it. These are very hardy trees for arid or drought type conditions. They do bloom. Their seeds are this nice little pink fluffy thing. There's like 50,000 of them per tree each season. So they go out and spread almost, into the wild if the soil is beneficial or is adapted. A couple of things that in doing some research I thought was very interesting about this tree. That the shade of the tamarisk is much cooler than that of other trees. And here we sit in a hot, somewhat desert area. Cool would be good. And so I think there was some intentionality around the choice. We know that these can withstand heat and long dry spells. The roots go deep to find underground water. They are very good for arid and saline climates. In fact, the other name for them is the salt cedar because they actually sweat out salt from their bark. They actually extract the salt out of the soil, and so some of them actually have been used through the years for soil conditioning. Where you have too much salt in the area, you use something like this to change the way or composition of the soil and remove some of the saline content. The wood is very hard and durable. It's ideal for making high-end or quality construction or furniture even. So you start thinking, okay, here he is living in a tent. Did he kind of foresee a world where construction was going to come? And more of the wood and things like that would be needed. They are slow growing, but they do get ultimately to about 30, 50 feet tall and spread pretty far. They have a long history of being used for medicinal purposes. They actually are a clotting agent for wounds. There's some herbs, forms they've been used for treating everything from dysentery to cholera. They also can be smashed in a pulp that becomes a vegetable product called manna, not to be confused with the stuff that came from heaven in Exodus, but it's almost honey-esque in its quality, very sweet. And the tamarisk trees can live over 100 years. These are long-standing trees. This wasn't some little bush or, short thing. And I love this quote by Von Dottie. It says, "It appears that Abraham did not simply plant any tree upon arriving in Beersheba. He planted a special tree to bring comfort and relief to the one who would live in a harsh desert environment. To a Bedouin or a Jew of the Middle East, the saying is you don't plant a tamarisk tree for yourself, you plant it for generations to come." So what is Abraham saying in planting the tree? I believe he is saying, okay, I believe you, God. This is my land, and for generations to come, my family is going to be here. He was literally staking a claim in this region, in this area, and we're going to see, his son and grandson coming through this exact region again and again, and ultimately he becomes part of Israel. And so I think his trust at this moment with God was, okay, I'm planting this tree partially as a symbol, but also in very practical terms for others' benefit in the future. And I think this is something that's important. We're going to see, obviously, on Easter, the idea that he was willing to sacrifice his son, that his faith has finally grown. We're finally seeing this pendulum swing from this just, erratic obedience to, okay, God, I'm in. And it's hard to know what else may have transpired besides just Isaac, but somehow I think he finally gets it. The preponderance of evidence is finally here where he's saying, okay, God, I trust you. And so shifting gears slightly, I want to keep us reflective of the idea that we are outsiders. We are not part of the nation of Israel. We are not Jews, and therefore we fall in this Gentile or outside category. And there's a couple of verses I think articulate it well. Romans 9:24 through 26. It says, "Even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also among Gentiles. As he says also in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. It shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. We are standing reconciled with God as outsiders who were bought at a price, who are called in to be co-heirs with Christ, to be a member of his royal priesthood, to be given the status of God's people, not based on birthright or genetics, but based on choice for the gospel. And Acts 13 says, for so the Lord has commanded us, saying, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord. As many were appointed to the eternal life believed. I think this should be our response. There should be a rejoicing that we get to be in relationship with God as outsiders brought in, as those who were distant or enemies or apart from God, now being reconciled to him, and having the privilege of saying to others around us, hey, come spend time with me. Let's talk. Let's build relationship. Let's demonstrate a caring relationship so that when you trust me, I can begin to share with you the idea of what is necessary for living a full and abundant life. We live in a world that's desperately seeking pleasure, instant answers, the quick fix. And although I don't think Scripture is a quick fix, I think it is an eternal fix. I think there is a fairly quick step to start the process of saying, okay, God, I'm open to this. I'll invite you into my life. I'll let you be Lord for now, and let's see how it goes. And for those of us that might have been a fair number of years ago, we might forget some of that initial joy. But I think for our friends, our family, for the people that we have in our sphere of influence that are apart from Christ, this is such a key point or a key element to saying, fitting in this culture is an increasingly difficult process. You're having to make some interesting compromises even in what is truth, what is reasonable. If you want to fit and you're going to be defined by the world's and culture's terms, it is starting to move very, very rapidly away from even what we might have considered traditional science. It's moving rapidly away on a morals view. It's moving rapidly away on a philosophical view. The New York Times used a phrase in an article last week I've latched onto. We live in a post-truth world. That now we can't even talk about something being true. What a frightening thing apart from God and from what we would say capital T truth. How in the world do I structure my life if there is no concrete reality or objective truth or objective importance and values? If it's all this relativistic transitioning or changing time, it almost feels like I'm playing Fashion Week in Paris. That somehow I just got to keep putting on new outfits and hopefully I'll find the one that, the critics like. And, if I'm the runway model, maybe it's 4 or 5 even in an afternoon. How is that a way to live life? I mean, it's great entertainment to watch these quick change artists that do it in, seconds and you're amazed. It's not so fun to do it in real life. That nothing around me has any substance or reality or is stable enough to count on it being true next week, next month. Where we as believers go, you know what? I know what is eternally true. I know there is bedrock to build a house on. We don't need to go do it at the ocean shore in the sand and hope it works out. We actually have things that have been proven to be good psychologically, scientifically, archaeologically, philosophically. And when I live them, I feel more fulfilled. When I oppose them or I fail, I know something is missing. I know I didn't get it best or right. And so Romans 5:7-9 says, for one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. You know, we have seen this process of coming from death to life, from hurt and darkness and unforgiveness into completeness and forgiveness and light and life. And granted, it's a journey. I mean, I think all of us that are sane says there's still steps in front of us. I haven't achieved perfection yet. But if there's a few miles behind, we can look back and go, thank God I'm not still dealing with some things I used to struggle with. I'm not a slave to some things anymore. You know, I'm not still stuck in an old pattern from 10 and 20 years ago. But that I am actually freed, I am redeemed, I've been bought at this great price because God called me. You know, it matters, and we're going to think about this as part of even apologetics. What is my life story distilled? Why do I believe that God is real to me? What are my experiences that has proven to me that God is a caring God who has intervened in my life events, and maybe even in some miraculous ways, so that I'm better off than I was when I started? Because I think in a world that is searching for anything that will make it better, and sadly more and more just numb is the optimal state in a secular world, we can experience the range. We can weep, you know, mourn with those that mourn. We can celebrate with those that celebrate. We can laugh. You know, both are within the continuum of our experiences, and our world isn't turned upside down by either one. We're not compelled to find temporal satisfaction because we now drink from a living water source, from a well that is eternal. And, you know, in many ways this seems simplistic, but it really is part of our journey, and I get it in different seasons. This may be easier or harder. But when we think about our relationships with non-believers, drawing from the biblical idea as well as the tamarisk tree, I think we initiate relationships, we plant seeds, we are fragrant, we aren't beating somebody over the head, we aren't necessarily just doing it purely for evangelistic reasons, but we are building bridges with those that are around us and trying to demonstrate loving behavior, action, choices. And in that process, I think we begin to nourish those friendships. It's sort of like watering or tending or caring for these new shoots or roots. I noticed several of my bulbs were coming up this weekend, and they're all under white stuff right now. I think it'll all be melted by this afternoon, but you know, it's not exactly the equivalent of nourishing. I don't know when I'll get my tomatoes planted this year. But I think it's this visual reminder for us. There is adversity that comes along. There are things that damages new relationships. And likewise, we've got to be that caretaker, the gardener, if you will, that's intent on not letting the small stuff get in the way, not letting the friction build up, not letting whatever rub we have as personalities stop us. And I think at the end of the day, really being prayerful that God will pour out His Spirit in those relationships, in our words, in our life. You know, I will be the first to admit this isn't always my first go-to. It's usually when I beat my head against the wall a couple of times and run into some real challenge, I finally then go, oh yeah, I should pray about this. But the people who I've known that have had great lifestyle evangelism have a disciplined practice of the people they're praying for every morning or every evening. You know, as they're working through a list of people that God's placed in their hearts. They're engaged in saying, God, I need your presence in this relationship. I need you to provide the words that are meaningful to this individual in their own circumstance, in their own ways. And I think at the end of the day, we're called to treat outsiders like insiders. I see with the way Christ engages with the, quote, sinners, all of them are drawn to Him. All of them want to be with Him. I wish I could say that every church in America had the view of the secular world they couldn't wait to get there. Unfortunately, that's not the prevailing thought. And there are a lot of valid critiques and invalid critiques. But I think in our relationship, in our individual walk in this world, am I bringing people along? Am I encouraging them? Am I the one that's one of the first phone calls when things aren't going well? They want my counsel and my input because they perceive that I am hearing from God. that God is with me. And Matthew 5:16 says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. You know, for me, this is a convicting verse. I wish I could reasonably conclude that when people looked at my life, they saw this nice bright light and it was compelling. I think at times it's like, you know, the battery or the half-dead battery in the flashlight that flickers a little, and maybe it's perfectly dark, there's a little light that comes, but certainly not this bright beam illuminating the night sky. And I think that it compels me to really look through and say, okay, what are the things that I'm doing in my life that is impeding that message? What are the things that are helping it? Where are the things that I need to continue to evolve and change and align to God better so that more people can see, look, yeah, there's flaws, but God is with him or her. God is real. I've seen it present in somebody's life. I've been blessed to have a couple of mentors that modeled this for me, you know, and my very first one, you know, in the midst of being away at boarding school and dealing with my own brokenness and rebellion, you know, his first encounter of me was running across the washer and dryers in the laundromat at the dorm. And he would have been well within his right to lose it. But instead, very lovingly said, no, we're not doing that. And he continued to demonstrate over a multi-year period of time this loving, gentle, kind spirit that began to draw me into Christ, that caused me to say, okay, I'm going to try this. My own human efforts aren't enough. And over multiple years, mentored me and really propelled me into a faith that was transformational. But it's because he lived in a way that it was unmistakable to me, even as a young kid. Something's different about this man. You know, God was with him. He had literally the patience of a saint to deal with 80 boys at a boarding school that was not probably for the academic value. It was probably for the remedial value. And it reminds me when I think of him, I've got a long ways to go. You know, I still have some sharp edges that aren't very Christ-like. And so I think just by way of summary, I think we are called by God for this time and this people. You know, that we think about all of history and Abraham being promised this great nation and Ishmael also being a great nation. Here we sit several thousand years later and are able to look back and say, oh, okay, I see how this promise is fleshed out. There are millions and millions of people that are descendants of these two individuals. You know, billions of people on this planet, thousands of years of recorded history. For some reason, in the year 2003 or 2023, God has said, I want you to be my witness in Spokane. And I'm even going to put you in a neighborhood. I'm going to put you at a particular church. And I'm going to give you a set of friends. And some friends have gone other places. New friends may have come into the community. But at the end of the day, I think it is not mistake. I think it was absolutely the plan of God before the beginning of creation, when he knit you in your mother's womb, to set in motion the events that transpire to this day right now. And it's not April Fool's anymore. It's not a joke. I think this is the reality that we have to embrace. No one else can do the ministry that God has called me to do. I also have repeatedly used this idea as a metric, that we are the only Bible some people will ever read. And that tends to be a convicting concept for me. But the new Ryan translation is not very accurate to the original Greek. It has some fundamental flaws and mistranslations. But is it enough? Is it enough of the gospel that is present in my life that somebody says, you know what? I want to know more. I want to understand why you operate the way you do, why you don't do the things that the secular world says is important, or you don't respond from the more baser natures of anger or bitterness or unforgiveness or whatever. And I think this is the place Christ continually convicts me. Look, you are an earthen vessel. I will fill you, but you've got to cooperate in this process of me shaping you. My wife's starting to take pottery and spinning class on the wheel, and she's realizing it looks really easy on TV. But it turns out one little finger out of position, the whole thing starts, going completely berserk. And so when we see this idea of God being the potter and us being the clay, I think we are participating in that process. We are deciding how God's going to mold and shape us, what things we're giving him permission to deal with. Are we going to end up as this very misshapen, weird modern art piece, or something functionally useful like a bowl or a cup or whatever we set out to? And will we withstand the fire of the kiln? Or do we shatter when the hard stuff of life hits? I think these are the things that we have to wrestle through, that maybe we need our own tamarisk tree at times for a little shade, a little break, a little sustenance. But I also think it's very true in my experience that no one is too tough or too lost for love and action. The one thing I've seen crack the most hardened heart is loving action. When we're there for them, when maybe they're a little prickly and cranky and not very lovable, and we do it anyways. I've watched lives transform. I've seen my own life transform that way, and I've seen others' lives transform that way. And not just in some theoretical sense, but rolling up and doing the tough stuff, of investing in the relationship with them, of genuinely going above and beyond, of being the one to offer up the cloak, to going the extra mile, to being engaged. When the hard stuff of life hits, wouldn't it be great if the secular world said, well, at least the Christians will be there for me? And to a large degree, there's some reality to that. I mean, the church is the leading instrument for widows and orphans in the world. It has been historically one of the leading instruments for funding of hospitals and scientific research. There have been seasons it's probably been more true than now. But I think in our own practical community where people deal with illness, they deal with homelessness, they deal with, their wounds, they deal with addiction, fill in the blank. Who are the people God's put in your life that he's calling you to be there for them in those hard moments? And quite honestly, you're probably going to get some sharp elbows. You're going to get hurt. I used to ride horses competitively, and so the way I would pay for that is I got to feed 42 horses every morning. And more than once or twice, I had to bail horses out of bad situations. Still remember one of them got tangled up in the barbed wire fence, and so I'm having to get its leg loose, cutting away with pliers and trying to get this thing free as it's tearing up its leg. And as soon as I finally get it free, it kicks me in the head. And I'm like, thanks. But I think in the reality of this world, when you are loving people, you're probably going to get kicked in the head or bitten. I mean, there's a high probability of that. Hurting people hurt other people. It is a reality, and I wish it wasn't. It is. And I think we've all had moments where we wanted to pull back because of that. Like, hey, don't bite the hand that's feeding you. But I think this is where Christ said, okay, yeah, you turn the other cheek. You go the extra mile. You die for others. That no greater love than one man can show for another than lay down his life. And so I think there is this place that is believers, we are challenged, and this isn't easy. I have fun all the time with people that are crazy enough to try and tell me, well, Christianity or religion is just a crutch. Okay, well, let's talk about then a day in the life of a Christian, where you're going to demonstrate the fruits of the Spirit. You're going to be quick to forgive. You're not going to get angry. You're certainly not going to stay angry. You're going to sacrifice your own interests and needs for those around you. You want to try it for 2 weeks and see how it goes, how easy it is? Because I found it's actually somewhat hard to do it well. To say you're going to do is easy, but actually living it and actually doing it is not so easy. I think we are called to a very hard but satisfying world. That rocky road up the side of the mountain is tough. It's work to get up to the top of the mountain, but that's where you get the great vistas. when you look over and see this amazing creation of God and maybe a sunrise or sunset depending. Those are moments that stick with you. But they come at a cost. They come because we're willing to roll up our sleeves and do the tough stuff of the gospel. That it's not just some intellectual pursuit. It's not just the holy huddle. It's not just we're going to bless those that bless us. But we're actually going to bless those that curse us. We're going to love those that hate us. This is the hard part of the gospel. And yet when you do it even a little bit, you start sensing the wind in your sail. You start sensing God's drawing nearer. You start sensing God is affirming you. And all of a sudden, life takes on this new quality of vibrance, of a nuanced world where you feel the presence of God being part of you and carrying along next to you. And it makes it a little easier to get kicked in the head. So for our discussion today, we'll break up into small groups again. We'll take about 10 minutes. Talk about one or more of these questions as you see fit. What are you doing to bless or plant a seed for generations that are to come? What are the things you're doing today that leave a legacy? You know, the proverbial tamarisk tree in the spiritual universe. Who is someone that does not share your values that you need to build a friendship with? And maybe this is somebody that unfriended you on Facebook. Who knows? But who is it that maybe God puts in your heart? Is there an area of conflict in your life right now that you need to try and remedy? You know, that we need to be the peacemaker. We need to be the first to say, you know what, I'm sorry for my part in this. You know, I want to be different. And how well does your love for others represent God's love? You know, when we think about God's perfect love for us, we're all going to fall somewhat short, but where are the places maybe it's succeeding? And where are the places you go, you know, that needs some work. I could be more loving in this way. So we'll take about 10 minutes and talk through those and see how that conversation goes.